Susan, you frame this as a prison break, which absolutely makes sense in the context of Gaza being an open air prison and the level of siege, even concentration camp conditions that we've seen there. Norm, I've interviewed you myself, and we've talked about the relationship sort of between what happened on October 7th and sort of Nat Turner's rebellions historically, and sort of how we can make certain kinds of political but also moral judgments on Hamas's decision and other affiliate groups to resist an unlivable set of conditions. So I just want to talk a little bit more about that. Sort of how did we get here? I'm incredibly frustrated that the media, the Western media, believes that history began on October 7th, or that the history of Israel-Palestine begins on October 7th. So I want to talk about October 6th and before. To each of you, I'm going to start with you, Norm. Sort of, how did we get here? What are Hamas didn't wake up one day on October 7th and decide to pick up arms. This is a process. Talk to me about that journey, that process.
Always in these questions, there's the point of departure. Where do you start? I will just start where I think is probably the best place, the right place, which is 1948, where Gaza became Gaza. In the course of the 1948 war, the estimates are about 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from the area that became the State of Israel. About up to 300,000 of those expellees ended up in Gaza, and they overwhelmed the population that lived there. So at this point, about 80% of Gazans are either refugees from 1948 or descendants of refugees from 1948, still classified as refugees. And the population of Gaza has, from the beginning, resisted its fate. And there were periodic guerrilla attacks from Gaza, but really wasn't mostly guerrilla attacks from 1949 to 52, 53. Overwhelmingly, the Gazans were just trying to return home. They were what the historian Benny Morris calls economic infiltrees, Infiltres, economic. They wanted to return home. They wanted to cultivate their fields. They wanted to see their old friends and neighbors in Israel. And when 1956 happens, is when Israel, the UK, and France invade Egypt, they took over Gaza, the Israelis. And when they took over Gaza, they committed these really gruesome massacres. Literally hundreds of Gazan men were just lined up and shot dead in places now the names are familiar to the world, in places like Khan Yunis and Rafah. There were several hundred Palestinians who were simply, Gazan Palestinians who were simply slaughtered. In 1967, when Israel takes over Gaza and the West Bank, there was also resistance, and Ariel Sharon, who was a figure in that era, not known anymore to young people, but had a reputation for extreme brutality. He was known as the Butcher of Beirut. In 1970, he entered Gaza and committed these quite horrible atrocities and large-scale population displacements. By 1991, when the first Intifada began, Israel began what came to be called the closure policy. And the closure policy was effectively to seal off Gaza from the West Bank and seal off Gaza from the world. I would want to note, even before I go there, because a lot of people, I can understand it. I don't have a problem trying to understand people who I think are acting out of good faith. A lot of people recoil at the term concentration camp to describe Gaza. It's interesting, already as far back as 1955, when Egypt controlled Gaza, this is before Israel. Already in 1955, the main UN representative in Gaza, his name was E.L.M. Burns, He described Gaza as a concentration camp. You come to 1967, Al Gore, our Al Gore, who was vice president, ran for president, his father visited Gaza either in June or July 1967. I can't remember which month. And he said Gaza is a concentration camp. That's how he described it. Now, I'm less concerned here about the technical accuracy, whether it's by Oxford English Dictionary, it qualifies as a concentration camp or not. By Oxford's dictionary, I believe it does, but let's just leave that aside. What's striking to me is concentration camp was already a known term in 1955.
Right.
By 1967, it was strongly associated with the Nazi Holocaust. But everybody who goes there, the first image that leaps to mind when they see Gaza, the first image is a concentration camp. And I should think if that's the image that leaps to every witness's eye, there must be something about that reality that calls to one's imagination the term concentration camp. As I said, by 1991, Israel embarked called a closure policy, which is to effectively seal off Gaza from the West Bank and from the world. Fast forwarding to 2006, there's an entity called the Palestinian Authority, which has administrative responsibilities for maintaining the occupation, for maintaining Israel's occupation. The Palestinian Authority, exactly as you would imagine under those circumstances, they're acting as Israel's surrogates. They are hopelessly corrupt and incompetent. And so there were parliamentary elections in 2006, ironically enough, imposed by the United States. President Bush at the time called for what was called at the time democracy promotion. And one of the areas to quote unquote promote democracy was the West Bank and Gaza, the occupied Palestinian territories. He called for elections. Hamas didn't want to participate because they saw the elections as part of what they called the Oslo process, namely legitimizing the Israeli control. But they were exhorted. They participated, and to their surprise, they won. They won the parliamentary election. Immediately as they won, the US, the EU, and Israel, of course, imposed this brutal economic blockade on Gaza in order to impose so much misery on the people of Gaza that they would overthrow the Hamas government. That's a standard tactic. Everybody knows it. I go as far back and further than when the socialist government came into power in Chile in 1973. The policy of Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State at the time, he says that we're going to, and this is the literal words he used, you can just look it up, it's everywhere. He said, we're going to turn the screws on Chile until the economy screams. Until the economy screams, meaning impose so much misery in Chile that they will overthrow the Allende government, which they did. And so the same tact, which is what you might call tactic, which you can call standard operating procedure, was now imposed on Gaza. And they imposed what was called a humanitarian minimum diet. Humanitarian minimum diet was basically a starvation plus diet. And that meant they literally, not figuratively, they counted the calories of the people in Gaza so as to ensure they won't cause a mass famine. They would keep them alive, but with a minimum caloric intake. And between the blockade and the periodic Israeli high-tech killing sprees in Gaza, what Israel calls its operations, or more colloquially, what it calls the mowing of the lawns in Gaza. The basic fact is, by October 6th, 2023, the day before the event being commemorated today, the people of Gaza, overwhelmingly the militants who breached the gates of Gaza on October 7th, they had been born into a concentration camp. They were left to languish in a concentration camp, and their fate was to die in a concentration camp. And on October 7th, remember, at that point, on October 6th, Gaza had completely vanished from the world stage. All the talk was about the Abraham Accords and whether or not, if and when, Saudi Arabia would become part of the Abraham Accords. So all of the diplomacy at the time was occurring over the heads of the people of Gaza, who would be left to languish and die. On October 7th, Hamas attempted what you might call a roll of the dice. Namely, they wanted to shatter the status quo. Decent, reasonable people can disagree. I don't agree with Susan Abulhawa. I do believe we have enough information about what happened on October 7th. We have the UN report from Navi Pillay. We have the Human Rights Watch report. They're quite detailed. And one of the aspects of the report, which makes it pretty compelling, is a lot of the evidence came from Hamas. A lot of it came from the videos they took of what was happening on those days. I believe, and I said it to a friend, he's now a senior member of Hamas, but we used to correspond, just correspond. His name is Bassem Naim, or Naim Bassem, or Bassem Naim. A very smart guy. He's got two PhDs, and he's sort of the main spokesperson for Hamas. And we used to correspond in the past. And I said to him after October 7th, I said, Bassem, don't bother denying what happened. Something horrible happened. Don't bother denying it. Do what the abolitionists did. They didn't deny what happened with the Nat Turner rebellion. They didn't deny it. And it was horrible. No question about it. What they did was to say, we told you so. That's what the abolitionists kept saying. Talking to white people, we told you so. You treat people this way, you treat people this way, you treat people this way. Don't react in shock and indignation when they do what any human being in those circumstances would have done.
It's an interesting moral question, Susan. I want you to jump in because I have a few things to ask you. There's a way to think about it that way. Like, I told you so. People will do these horrible things if you keep them in horrible conditions. But then there's another position that many people have taken, which is to say, by virtue of them being placed in these horrible conditions, the act itself isn't horrific or horrible, right? That Hamas has a moral right to defend itself and to use violence, and that those people who are occupying that space, even so-called innocent people or civilians, by virtue of being in a military, in an illegal settlement, or by virtue of being there, are themselves not innocent in the way that we would imagine, someone to be, any more than a white person in a slaveholding state might be. So there are different positions to take about this, even around the morality of it.